The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author and organizer Jane McAlevey on her new book, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. Plus, the millionaires who want to pay more taxes, not less. Bill Press talks with Erica Payne, Executive Director of Patriotic Millionaires. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. At a time when workers are under attack at historic levels, strikes are making a comeback. In that, Jane McAlevey sees an opportunity to reset power and politics in America and clear a path to progressive change. And we say hello to Jane McAlevey, an organizer, author, and scholar. She's currently a senior policy fellow at the University of California at Berkeley's Labor Center, part of the Institute for Labor and Employment Relations. Jane's most recent book, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. Jane McAlevey, thanks so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
It is my pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. This new book won a starred review from Publishers Weekly. That's a rare accomplishment, and congratulations to you. In their review,
thank you.
You're quite welcome. Publishers Weekly called the book, quote, a persuasive argument that the power of strong democratic trade unions can fix many of America's social problems, close quote. What puts labor unions at the center of progressive change?
I think a few things. One is, if you look at just the last 2 years, since there's been sort of a revival of mass collective action, meaning these really large strikes we're having, primarily in the education sector, though not just in the education sector, which is important. I think what you see is the American public standing up and rallying behind a fairly beleaguered institution, by the way, known as the teaching profession, right? That's been under extremely serious attack for 20 years. And despite that, what we realized when the workers decided to, take the future of the education system into their own hands and walk off the job to demand that it returned to being a better education system that we once had in this country when it was well funded, before the right wing and the people with the tax cuts began attacking our education system. You see the extraordinary support and solidarity that's breaking out all over the United States. So that's, to me, one example of why both unions matter and can get us out of the mess that we're in is severalfold. One is, fundamentally, people in this country do break in a solidaristic way with each other. Yes, we have a problem with white nationalism, but most people in this country break in a way that breaks towards human solidarity when they see workers standing up for themselves. And we need a lot more of that in this country, both because we need more solidarity, like an active solidarity right now, and because we definitely need workers standing up for themselves. So part of what I try and say in the book is, if you look at two things, which are not going to be unfamiliar to your listeners. One is the current state of the U.S. Supreme Court, and by the way, not just the Supreme Court, the federal judiciary at this point, right, has been stacked with more extreme right-wing justices than certainly ever in my lifetime. And then in addition to that, you've got, the sort of series of Supreme Court decisions that have made it so that dark money is really running our political system, and that's not going to get undone anytime soon. So as an organizer and a strategist, when I look around at what's available to ordinary Americans to fix the mess called the United States right now, there's one thing left, which is strikes and trade unions and people demanding in the workplace what we deserve, because the democratic institutions that have long governed this country are hugely broken right now. And to reset them, I think is going to take in 2020, 2022, 2024, 2025, 6, 7, this entire coming decade is going to take what it took in the 1930s to reset political power and balance in the United States. And that took workers in large numbers walking off the job.
Well, and in specifically thinking of the teachers' strikes that we've seen, and again, not exclusively to education, but it's not just about their pay. It's about the whole system. Yeah. And I think that's where you're really starting to pick up some steam and getting some people that are maybe out on the fringes or don't even know anything about it, saying, hey, that's not right. These folks need help, and they get the support that way.
Yeah, that's right. And that's an important point you're making, because it reflects the education strikers. I'm just going to call them education because it's bigger than just teachers. But these teachers and educators with them who are walking off the job are doing it in a way where they're making very clear that their demands list is a great education system. It's the schools every kid deserves, right? That's the theme throughout the education strikes, is educators striking to demand a rebuild of the public education system to the point where, and again, just to state the obvious, like good the way it was when it was more robustly funded before the 1980s and decades of tax cuts came. When I went to public school, we had a full-time nurse in our school. We had, before school started, sports and athletics. We had after school started sports and athletics. We had art every single day and gym every single day, and a nurse and a librarian and a guidance counselor. Do you know how few schools have that right now? And that's one reason only, which is the super rich and the corporate elite of this country pocketing all the money that used to go to places like to fund art classes and guidance counselors and school nurses. Literally the difference between the late 1970s and early 1980s, when I was still a public high school student, and today is that there's a bunch of money lining the already bulging pockets of the super rich. And that has got to be reversed in this country. And I honestly, my read as both an organizer in the trade union sector and a contract negotiator, but also like I've run political campaigns and environmental campaigns, like my entire life experience and then my PhD work and my postdoc work at Harvard have all confirmed for me there really is no other way out of the mess that we're in this country of extreme polarization fueled by a sort of faux populist right, unless and until workers begin to stand up for themselves, again, in really large numbers, and do it in a way that the teachers are doing it, meaning message the broader community that this fight we're having is not about our wages, it's about our wages, right? Like the entire country's wages. Like every fight right now is about a fight for the future of this country.
Absolutely. And you brought something up. Let's talk about the historical context for the book. It's decades of a concerted effort by folks that you brought up earlier, corporate class, and the willing politicians, willing to suppress the labor movement in the U.S. What do you consider the most damaging impact of that effort that we're living with today?
I think one that's becoming more and more familiar to people, and it's in part thanks to the candidacies of people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and, the sort of non-corporate Democrats, people are actually talking again about the single biggest blow. There was one massive blow, which was the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, and that was the act that was passed to roll back the clock on the gains that American workers were making, right? So there's a history chapter in the book, and I break it down into three waves of attacks on American workers. One was the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 that sort of presaged and began the Cold War period. The second was what I call the weaponization of globalization. Like when I look back in history, I think, frankly, when we all look back at history, we're going to realize that this thing called globalization was nothing but union busting, which is what I argue in the book. Like it really served no function except to break unions in the sort of industrial West in the United States and Europe, et cetera, and to offshore every decent unionized job from Germany to France to England to the United States to Canada to some place where workers have no rights and something much closer to slavery exists. And that is a large part of the world, quite frankly, right? When you're locked into a factory, a Foxconn factory making iPhones in China, by the way, you have zero rights. You have no rights. So that that corporations decided to offshore all of the best paying unionized jobs all over the world, to me is going to be understood as nothing but wave 2 of massive union busting. And then the third wave began essentially with the 2010 midterms. A lot of work on the part of the, I think often smarter than the Democrats or smarter than the progressives, like the super right wing in the form of the Koch brothers, that ilk, Karl Rove, the crowd that's been dominating the political discourse and really, frankly, out-muscling or outsmarting a lot of the progressives, is that they focused for like 20 years on the census and taking state legislatures. When they got them, which they needed to undo the public sector, which most Americans don't understand, so I'm just going to get the three waves clear for you, is that they had to find a way into the states because public sector labor law is governed state by state, not by one federal law, the way the National Labor Relations Act is. So 2010 marks the beginning of the third wave, which is like the vociferous, brutal attack on the public sector unions that we've been seeing, right? Sustained attacks since 2010. So three big waves. 1947, attack on all unions. That's the Taft-Hartley Act. And then I pinpoint it to like 73, 72, 73, 74, the beginning of a concerted effort at offshoring jobs in a really massive way, not just a little plant, but going. And the sort of architecture and the narrative of neoliberalism taking hold in the United States. And then 2010 begins what we call like the final offensive, right? Like in the mind of the Koch brothers, they are damn close to wiping unions out in this country. We are down to less than 6% in the private sector and less than 11% overall. So those are pretty terrifying numbers, except if you realize, which we should put this part on a positive note, those were the same numbers in 1932, right? And then the biggest growth in unions ever happened essentially overnight. Like you could see a scenario where a non-corporate Democrat wins the White House and behaves the way Roosevelt did, right? An unconventional president wins the presidency. It's a remote possibility, and I don't mean unconventional like a white nationalist like the one we have. I mean unconventional in a good way. Wins the presidency, right? I mean, we've got an unconventional lunatic.
I think I was safe in assuming what you meant on that one.
I know. But, the important thing for listeners is American unions were this down in the dumps at the end of the 1920s. And that period feels a lot to me like the late 1920s and the very early 1930s does feel similar in a lot of ways, not just in the U.S., but in the global historical moment we're in of like strong men, authoritarianism, Trump-like racist white nationalists, anti-immigrant characters, all over the place winning office. By the way, not winning legitimately, by the way, but I should say becoming the quote-unquote elected leaders in many a country. So the periods are the feel around the world. I'm working a lot in Europe now. It feels a lot like the United States. Unions are under attack. Working class people are under attack. People are getting the sort of elite, have merged across the top of all the political parties. And they're ruling for themselves, and unless people in this country start to stand up for themselves again, we're going to be in a lot more trouble. But I think if people stand up for themselves right now, as we're seeing people doing, we have a real shot at turning this whole thing around in a pretty profound way.
We're speaking with Jane McAlevey. She is a senior policy fellow at the University of California, Berkeley's Labor Center, part of the Institute for Labor and Employment Relations. And her latest book is A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. And Jane, now kind of turning the focus to the current context of the book, is that unions are making a comeback. Why now? Is it more than just the strikes?
I think the strikes are reflective of the absolute state of despair that most of Americans find themselves in, to be honest. And that's what I mean about it feeling a bit like 1930 and 31 and 32 in this country right now, right? I mean, there was like 1 in 4 people were unemployed in the Great Depression. I'm arguing in the book that the same level of misery exists right now. It's just more, it's not as easy to see because you can't just say 1 in 4 are unemployed. What you can see, if you're like me out in the field as a union organizer, is people running to like make 5 different jobs make sense, and they're working 90 hours stitching together 5 different kinds of pay systems, and they're falling behind, and it's both parents working, not one. And frankly, people are committing suicide, right? Our birth rate is going down. I mean, there are very serious things wrong in this country, very serious things wrong. And people really, like, once you get out of like a major urban area, and even if you're in it, if you keep your eyes wide open in a certain way, you will just see the level of misery that's going on in this country. People are realizing that the system is horribly skewed against them. The most disgusting of all the tax cuts, the most recent one, right, in 2017 under Trump, just the super rich get a giant tax break. I think people have had it. I mean, to put it bluntly, I just think people have had it. And the question is, are we going to trend in a right-wing populist direction, or are we going to trend in a progressive populist direction? And I think the unions that have led those big strikes are pulling us in the direction of a more progressive form of populism, just like they did in 1932 and 33, right? I mean, we didn't get the big benefits from FDR's administration. I mean, we got relief, right, from insanity the minute he took over, which we could get again if someone good won. Just relief from, like, are we going to war tomorrow in Iran? You know, I mean, we need relief from a lot of pain right now. But to turn the whole system around, it took FDR another 3 years, and it took workers, by the way, striking like crazy in 33 and 34. And I lift that up a lot in the book because I think people forget. Like, they think, oh, FDR, the New Deal, things just got good for the average worker. You know, there were massive strikes that happened in 32, 33, 34, right up until 35 when Congress began, you know, forced by a level of strike activity in this country that was bringing, frankly, corporations and the capitalist class kind of to its knees legislatively, because that's what big strikes can do. And I'm arguing we're going to have to do a whole lot more of them before we can imagine bringing the power imbalance back to something somewhat fair in this country, right? Income inequality is a reflection of power inequality. And the power inequality we're trapped right now, given the political, like the campaign contribution system in politics is so broken. Everyone knows that. The Supreme Court is only recently broken. People are just starting to understand how broken our court system is about to be. And again, he's got all those federal judiciary judges stacking every single one of the federal district courthouses right now, not just the Supremes. And if you take those two things together, I am sorry, but I see no other. I mean, I've worked every part of the progressive movement in this country. I was a community organizer, an environmental organizer, a political campaigner, and then found my whole life home, you know, in the labor movement. And I don't think there's any way out. And as an organizer, I've had the experience, even just in the last couple of years, of like working with workers to win contracts that are literally life-changing, that change the entire life of the family, and depending on how big the facility is, the whole community around them. And that kind of rebalancing of economic and political power is going to come through strikes.
We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. We're talking with Jane McAlevey about her new book, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. We'll have more of that conversation in just a moment. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
This is a make-or-break year for many migrants seeking to improve their families' financial conditions. They say that they're being persecuted in their homeland, yet they fear being vilified for crossing the border. What to do? These are not impoverished families south of the border, but a few thousand super-rich Americans who are trembling in their U.S. mansions, contemplating expatriation. Do they stay in the USA or abandon the homeland for some super-friendly haven for the super-rich? What's got these faint-hearted patriots on the brink of renouncing their citizenship is nothing but a craven fear of a modest tax increase. While Trump has thrilled them by slashing the already low rate they pay toward America's common good, they're now in a tizzy because, eek, here comes Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and a multitude of voters angry at the devious, self-indulgent tax dodging of corporations and wealthy elites like them. A New York lawyer who helps rich clients expatriate says, "We have people who are totally spooked about the prospect of a Warren presidency and a wealth tax." What a bunch of wimpy, worthless Americans. First, Warren's tax plan totally exempts the first $50 million of anyone's wealth. Second, it assesses only a tiny tax surcharge on the rest of the wealth they're hoarding. Third, they'd still be fabulously rich, ranking among the wealthiest 1/100% of Americans. And fourth, the money raised would greatly advance America, the American people, and America's democratic values. That's why the wealth tax is supported by 77% of Democrats, 55% of independents, and, 57% of Republicans. This is Jim Hightower saying, if these rich abdicators' appreciation for what our country has given to them is so selfish, who needs them?
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you. The Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're talking with Jane McAlevey about her powerful new book, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. She makes the case that unions are central to challenging the corporate class and restoring democracy in America. But what about the millions of workers who don't have a union? For Jane McAlevey, that translates into even more opportunity to build the power of organized labor. There are millions of American workers in non-union jobs. What's the potential now for unions to reach out to these workers, given the state of everything you just mentioned?
I mean, ironically, I think it's good. Like if the American unions would actually focus in a way that we need them to, which as an organizer is always the struggle I'm in, right? Like I believe unions are the solution. On the other hand, I've been in plenty of internal battles myself within the labor movement, right? It's not a perfect movement by any stretch, but it does represent the one institution that can right the ship of this country right now. And so for all those non-unionized workers, there's 2 things that are really interesting to me. One is something called the Epic Systems case, which was ruled on last year in the Supreme Court. It got very little attention. And the Epic Systems case essentially says, very complicated case. So it's 3 cases they rolled into one. I'm just going to say the obvious thing it does. It points non-union workers to unions because it essentially said that federal arbitration law was going to supersede all other kinds of federal law, and that all the non-union workers in this country can now be bound as a condition of hiring by binding mandatory arbitration agreements. So now 60%, that's 60%, and the number is going up almost every day. I keep tracking it. 60% of non-union American workers are now under forced arbitration agreements that include things like, you cannot, all of them basically say you can't enter a class action lawsuit. So all of the legal redress that was available to American workers sort of post-civil rights movement through the women's movement up until last year have been stripped away from American workers. You can no longer, most of those arbitration agreements say you can't sue your employer. You can't sue your employer individually. You can't sue your employer through a class action lawsuit. Many of the arbitration agreements that 60% of Americans are being forced to sign right now as a condition of hire say you can't even talk to a coworker about a complaint you have at work, or you're in violation of a forced agreement you had to sign to get the job. So, and most people don't know they're signing them. I want to be really clear about this. Most Americans do not know when you're sitting through the new orientation packet that you're given. It's like, sign this for your whatever, sign that for your whatever, waive your whatever. They're signing these forced arbitration agreements. And by the way, most don't have a choice, right? You need a job. You sign that piece of paper. The one way out of forced arbitration agreements governing most American workplaces, and again, they're on the uptick quickly now that the Supreme Court codified this in its last session. The only way out of it is to form a union and to bargain a collective hire agreement over an individual arbitration agreement. It's literally the only thing left. So black workers who used to sue racist employers, or women at the height of the Me Too movement, right? The Supreme Court passes this thing saying forced arbitration agreements are going to supersede other kinds of law, like the Fair Standards Act. I mean, it's an amazing ruling, and because Americans, so few Americans, why would you understand the details of employment law? Didn't pay attention to it. The case that got all the attention last year was the Janus case, right? Which essentially meant that every single public sector union across the country, every worker can drop or join the union every day, even if it's a unionized workplace. So that case got all the attention. The case from a union organizer's perspective that matters a great deal is the Epic Systems case, because one, most American workers just got a really bad deal from the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, that's a really bad ruling. And two, the only way out of that ruling is to form a union. So I say, form a union.
Right. The short story is unionize.
Yeah, or be bound, by these horrific rules that employers are passing now. Anyway, it's crazy.
Sports Illustrated, falling apart. Every single corner of the place, it's a shambles. They're unionizing. It's their one way to try and survive. It's so it's a lot of different ways that union and unionizing and union organizing can help and save a job and make a job better. In writing this book, you traveled the country, spoke to workers in many sectors of the economy. You've spent most of your life in the labor movement. Did anything surprise you?
Yeah. No. Well, I think the one thing that has surprised me in the most pleasant way is because the thing I touched on earlier, it isn't just watching Americans stand up and support striking workers. It is, even though the education strikes really have been education, meaning that there's been the West Virginia strike that kicked it all off, right? The bus drivers, the cafeteria workers, they were all actually, in my analysis of the West Virginia strike, which I've written about for a lot of magazines, and it's also in the book, that strike, which is called the teacher strike, wouldn't have happened if the bus drivers hadn't walked off the job, literally. And that's what a bunch of superintendents told me in West Virginia too. If the kids were being delivered to the schools, there would have been injunctions against the teachers. So that's an important lesson, that it takes all the workers to win. But then if you look at, in terms of what excites me, if you look at the unbelievable and strategic attack on teachers and teachers unions that's been 25 years strong. I think it starts in 1995. We have Hollywood movies like Waiting for Superman. We have, a story a day, blaming the failure of public schools on teachers and teachers unions. And despite that, it's like watching the teachers unions rip the scab of lies that is like a house of cards for the white nationalists and the radical right in this country, because no matter how much messaging they did to try to destroy the image of a teacher and a teachers' union specifically, the polling was something like 83% of Americans supported every teacher strike in the last 2 years. You know, that is the most encouraging thing. And if I were a worker who didn't have a union, I'd be running like mad to form one. It's hard to do, by the way. The book tells you a lot about it. Actually, the chapter I wrote called How to Get One is from the last big campaign I was just running, where we helped nurses and technical workers in 7 hospitals in Philadelphia form unions in 2016 and 2017. It was a bit of a record, but we did it. And I walked people through like what it took for those workers to form new unions. And so the book has there's a lot in the book that instructs people on how to get a union. And then I also have a chapter called How Do You Rebuild One? Because I end it on the magnificent strike by the Los Angeles teachers. And that's a great example of a union that, quite frankly, wasn't all that exciting for like 20 years. It got kind of, do nothing-ish, like institutions can get if they're not kept lively. And in that last chapter, I wrote a whole chapter about how a bunch of good teachers came in and rebuilt that union and took it over. And boy, it's night and day. It's a beautiful, powerful instrument of the working class in city politics, in federal. There were those 7 congressional seats that flipped. I make this point in the LA Teachers Union chapter. Those 7 congressional seats that were crucial to the takeover of the House in 2018 in the midterms, 7 of them came from Greater Los Angeles, where, that election turnout was directly benefited from the extraordinary strike building work that was going on among the teachers union in Los Angeles. So yeah, there's a lot of encouraging things out there. The question is, can the progressive movement, focus? You know what I mean? And that's what I'm trying to call attention to. Yes, there's a lot of things that need attention. There's a lot of things that we need to protest. There's a lot of things we need to resist. But at the end of the day, if we're trying to figure out how to save American democracy and literally end the most extreme polarization of my lifetime, and again, I understand that there were periods that were highly polarized in the 60s and 50s and earlier, but coming of age, coming out of high school after Ronald Reagan was already president, or being able to vote after Reagan was already president. In my entire lifetime, we haven't had a moment this polarizing. And as a union organizer, we deal with high, intense polarization all the time in the workplace, right? That's what every union buster does. And I say, hey, people, the union buster's in the White House, and he's running the whole country like it's one big union busting campaign right now, driving division, driving wedges between us. And people who do union organizing are really familiar with this. And so using the tools that union organizers have learned about how do we build supermajority unity in the face of huge polarization, that is the lesson right now that I think the progressive movement needs to wake up, take a break, stare at it. What has the capacity to unify America? Because a good union fight unifies really disparate people of different ethnicities and different genders and different backgrounds. Every union fight is like a mini example of how you unify America with union busters that are just like Stephen Miller, Stephen Bannon, and Donald Trump. So it's like my whole universe is a bunch of awful human beings driving an evil agenda that divides working people, and then they win, right? And in a union campaign, we have to overcome that, and we do, and then we defeat them. The whole country needs that right now.
The beginning part of that sounded like a nightmare you might have been having, actually. You mentioned Bannon and the rest. But before we let you go, we are in the midst of an election season. I'm not sure if you knew that. I think you probably did.
Oh, are we?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Democrats they'll work hard to convince working class voters to support them. But what do they have to do to make that genuine? Because I'm not hearing that across the board.
Yeah, I'm not either, to be honest. I mean, part of why I mentioned Warren and Sanders is because I think there is so much legitimate cynicism in this country, legitimate right now, towards, frankly, both parties, right? That's how we wound up with the Donald Trump in the White House, in addition to division and a whole bunch of other things. But it's voter suppression, electoral college. Okay, we digress. But I think you can't. Part of what matters, my experience as a union organizer, again, always highly polarized. Every election I've run, like winning a union election with thousands of workers inside of a big hospital, say, and which I've spent a lot of my life doing, is incredibly difficult because they just, the employers control all the rules, functionally speaking, during union elections. So they're totally skewed, just like American elections are becoming totally skewed, which is why I keep thinking we have to look at what union organizers deal with in order to figure out how to overcome what's going on in this country. But so I think part of the thing that I teach, and I tell people when I'm teaching workers how to win, is the person who you need to recruit in your unit or your shift, and in the case of political races, in your political precinct, are the people who are most trusted by their coworkers, because that is who their coworker will look to at a moment when the boss is saying, rip off your sticker, I'm going to fire you if you wear that union button, which, by the way, happens every day in an American election inside of a union. Like, they'll tell them to take off their stickers, take off your union buttons, and all illegal. They'll just say all these illegal things, right? Because that's what employer class does. So, and workers will take them off, and workers will lose their election if they do, and workers will take them off because they're scared. And so the way that we win is by recruiting the most trusted, which usually means very good workers. And so when I look at the national political race, I think the person who's likely to win is the person who people believe to be genuine in what they're actually promising on the campaign trail. Because people are sick and tired of being promised stuff and having it not happen in this country, right? That is part of why we wound up with a white nationalist, most dangerous person I've ever met in the White House right now, is because people are cynical that candidates across the parties are in fact not genuine. So I think what you raise matters a lot, and I'm going to argue that it's the people who have been genuine for a long time in their beliefs that stand the best chance of winning in this country, and that brings us down to just a couple of them, in my view. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would have to agree. Jane McAlevey, organizer, author, scholar, senior policy fellow at the University of California at Berkeley's Labor Center. Jane's most recent book, again, A Collective Bargain, Unions, Organizing, and the Fight for Democracy. Jane, we appreciate your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. We'd love to do it again with you soon.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. The millionaires who are fighting for a living wage for all working citizens and a fair tax system. Bill Press talks with Erica Payne, Executive Director of Patriotic Millionaires.
Economic inequality has reached a crisis point. It's reached a destabilizing point in the country. 71% of Americans think the economy is rigged. They're right. I don't know where the other 29% are, but most of us have a clue that things have gone awry. It's gone awry in a lot of different areas. But this group thinks that if we just start with some really basic reform of the political economy, that we'll be able to make some progress. So we look at it like this. There are three values we want to advance in the American political debate. Number one, if you work full-time, you should be able to afford your basic needs. That seems pretty straightforward. We translate that into a $15 federal minimum wage. Second piece, we think people should have an equal political representation. That's what we say that we espouse to. Why do the wealthy in this country have so much more political power than everyone else? And third, we need some resources to reinvest in the country, on a state level, local level, and on the federal level. So we think that the people who are doing best should put more into the bucket to make sure that everybody else can do well. So political equality, a livable minimum wage, and a fair tax system. Very straightforward.
Yeah, those three things, boom, 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 right?
And here's the thing about it, Bill. I think that if we my general theory is that if we can solve these things, we will have the cohesiveness and the stability as a society to be able to solve the big problems, the climate change problems, things that are going to really require us coming together as a nation and making some good decisions. And so if we can't get people to a place of stability, then they're too easy to manipulate. The areas of the country with the highest levels of despair are the areas in the country that voted for Donald Trump. And what is Donald Trump's political strategy? Division, 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 and hate. So we need to solve the cancer at the heart of it.
So it's unusual for somebody to say, please raise my taxes.
It is unusual.
Right?
Yeah.
How many people have you recruited to say that?
So we have a couple hundred members. And just to put it in context, there are about 500,000 people in the country who make more than $1 million a year.
That's your...
yeah, so our criteria for membership is $1 million in income or $5 million in assets. So it's not a middle-class person. $1 million in income is a lot of money, even if you're living in New York City. Mm-hmm. I lived in New York City. $1 million is still a lot of money. $5 million of assets, that's a nice nest egg. So we start there and say, let's address that problem, get taxes raised on those folks. So the 500,000 people about who are in that place, we've got 200 members, so we have some work to do, I would say, right?
Isn't it, doesn't the definition of who's rich sort of differ depending on where you live?
I think it does differ where you live. I mean, certainly if you have $1 million where I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, you have a lot more money than if you have $1 million and where I've ultimately lived in New York. But I do think at a certain point, we've just got to call it, let's stop being silly about this. $1 million just about anywhere in the world is rich. And if you feel poor on $1 million a year, you should move. Yeah.
So these are your three goals, particularly on focusing on we want to pay higher taxes. What do your members do about it?
We do two things, really. We basically run a large public education campaign that we do through an earned media strategy. So we talk to a lot of reporters and activists. We speak at rallies. I mean, the goal here is to let the public know that things have gone amiss and that we can fix them. That's number one. And then number two, the problem with all of this stuff is the last mile problem. And that's, the technology term. If you get the telephone pole into the middle of the town square, you still have to get the phones and the wires into each one of the houses. Yeah, we have a last mile problem, and that last mile problem is right here in Washington, D.C. These lawmakers spend their time with lobbyists. They spend their time with rich people. They pay no attention to what everybody else needs. And so the group spends a huge amount of time on the Hill every day talking to these lawmakers, seeing if we can make some progress.
And tell them this is one thing you consider, because if you look at it, Congress seems determined to cut the taxes for the wealthy. And they did so under George W. Bush. They did
100%.
And under Donald Trump, and Barack Obama even continued for a while the Bush tax cut.
Well, and we actually started, the group started in 2010 in opposition to President Obama, because during the lame duck session of Congress, it became clear that he was going to cave to Republican demands to extend the Bush tax cuts for incomes over $1 million a year. And I thought that was preposterous. There does come a point where it's just enough already, And so that's why I think this group of millionaires, everybody likes to be rich. Good, great. There comes a point where it's just an absurdity. And then you end up, one of the things our chairman talks about, Morris Pearl, he's wonderful. He was at BlackRock forever. And he says, listen, I am not any more altruistic than the next guy. I'm just greedy for a different kind of country. His daughter-in-law's from Peru. He's like, look, we don't want that level of economic disparity in this country. It's not fun for anybody, including rich people.
So your members are on the Hill. They're talking to senators. They're talking to members of the House. Have they changed any minds? Have they...
I think we have. Look, so one of the bills that we supported was H.R. 1, which passed with 100% of the Democratic votes in this is a democracy reform bill. All of these different, how to bring one of the first
2019.
Bills. Early 2019.
One of the first bills.
I think it was the first bill, HR 1. Yeah,
Speaker
the
Pelosi
first bill. Yes,
pushed,
and it's a whole range of democracy reforms, from helping get money out of politics to extending voting rights and all of those kinds of things that help bring that political equality piece to the front. We also passed in the House the minimum wage bill to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour and eliminate the tipped wage. Now, of course, it's sitting in the graveyard of Mitch McConnell, and his refusal to bring anything up for a vote. But minimum wage is lower today by 30% than it was in 1968 at its peak. No one can live on $15,000 a year, which is how much you make if you make the minimum wage $7.25. No one can live on that. So that's absurd. But what's more important...
I'll underscore that. They're working full-time, they're paid the minimum wage, and they're living in poverty.
Oh, it's not even poverty. Level. I mean, it's not even, and the poverty line itself, like that can be a whole nother, we can talk about that at another thing. But I mean, I just get your head around $15,000 a year for working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. This is insane. And what it does is it drags down the wage scale for everyone. So we're looking at a situation right now where 40% of Americans make less than $30,000 a year. And then think of the pain that they're suffering. 2.5 million people addicted to opioids. For the first time in our country's history, life expectancy is going down for segments of our population. Last year, deaths of despair, deaths due to suicide, alcohol, and drugs, higher than they've ever been. A great new study came out just a couple of days ago that showed if you raise the minimum wage by $1, suicide rates among that population go down. This is really a life or death thing, and we just gave these companies a huge tax cut. Let's demand they pay their workers.
Right. I do want to ask you just a little tangent. So a great article in the January 6th issue of the New Yorker magazine.
Yes, it was fun.
About the Patriotic Millionaires and about one of your outstanding members, Abigail Disney.
She's awesome.
Heiress to the Disney fortune. And you talk in there about the name Patriotic Millionaires.
Yes.
Some of your members have a little problem with that. They're a little embarrassed by it.
Well, okay, so
I think why patriotic?
Listen, it was a very intentional naming back 9 years ago when I first went and got these folks to sign this letter and had to think of a URL for them. I think the conservative movement has been telling people the wrong story for a long time. What they've said to people is, it's your money, you made it all by yourself, and now the government's coming in and stealing it and giving it to undeserving poor people. And there's a racial overtone to that, by the way. It's usually poor people who are people of color. So that's the story the conservatives want you to believe. Well, I think there should be a different story. I think the story is that if you love your country, you do what's necessary to keep that country strong. And if you're a millionaire, what you need to do is pay more taxes. So it was a very deliberate name. Now, that said, all of the members hate it. Although I mentioned in the article that all of the members hate it, and we jokingly say that we set aside some time every time we get together so they can all fuss about it, how much they hate it and try to convince me to change it. And then I tell them we're not going to, we move on with the business. But I mean, it's a deliberately provocative name, and I really think that we have gotten to a place where who was this loser the other day who's out worth $2.something billion, and he's saying if we put a wealth tax, we're going to destroy the whole economy. And these people are just like utterly full of it. I can't even believe we give them airtime. I mean, come on.
Yeah. But Patriotic Millionaires, it catches your attention.
It catches your attention, it does. And that's the point, because here's the thing. The millionaire class destroyed this country and is in the process of destroying the country. The reason that you are poor, if you are, or the reason that you are struggling, if you are, there's a good chance that some millionaires had something to do with that. Mm-hmm. This peer group needs to get in a fight with the rest of its peer group and encourage them to do the right thing here.
Right. And so that's a good point. In addition to lobbying members of Congress, your members are also lobbying their fellow
They're lobbying their fellow members. Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. And they're at least bringing up the conversation. So what is not a secret anymore is that your greed and selfishness is destroying the country and that you are not doing the right thing. There's so many millionaires who are not doing the right thing. It's time to call them on it.
So I wanted to ask you about some of the specific steps that could be taken to improve the situation. Let's say you mentioned one of them. You talked about one of them, minimum wage.
Yeah.
Has not been raised in this country since...
It's not been raised in about a decade. I mean, and put it this way.
George W. Bush, I believe, right? $7.25.
$7.25 an hour. And let me tell you something that'll really make you crazy. So I worked at a restaurant my senior year in college in Chapel Hill called Spanky's. I made $2.13 an hour. If I went back to Spanky's today and applied for a waitress job, I would make $2.13 an hour.
That's the so-called tip workers.
50. I am 50 years old. This is crazy. It's an increase in sexual harassment. What if there's a snowstorm? Can't make your shift. And the thing is, the law is that they have to make up for it up to that whopping $725 number that's going to get you all the way to 15. That doesn't happen. Wage theft. It's too much abuse. Let's get that wage to a single wage.
Right. It is happening at some city and state levels.
Yes, which is marvelous. Marvelous.
Right.
That's real progress. That's real progress.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can make more progress in a state or a locality. But here's the thing. You've got a lot of folks who don't want it to happen. So you'll remember the transgender bathroom bill in North Carolina, my home state. Well, that was really not about the transgender bathroom. What it was about was they wanted to preempt Charlotte from raising its minimum wage. They couldn't get it passed with just that, so they wrapped the transgender bathroom bill around it to get Franklin Graham, the so-called Christian leader of the state, on board. That's how that happened. So, so even when the cities want to do it, sometimes these state governments will prevent them from doing it.
Well, they'll hide behind the federal level and
Yeah,
say they haven't raised it to federal level. One other issue that's related, of course, and in the New Yorker article with Abigail Disney talks about that, is executive compensation. Out of control. It's
ridiculous.
They mentioned the president of Disney at one time getting 1,400 times paid in his income. The average Disney worker. Obscene.
No, it's obscene. And here's the thing.
Is that an issue that you're
yes. And so actually we have to look forward to on next week, Abigail Disney is going to be testifying in front of the California legislature on a bill to tax excessive CEO compensation. We've got a hearing on that next week. It's SB 37. It's a fantastic bill. It would just add a different kind of incentive into the program.
Right. Is there...
But it's not even, it's worse than that. So the CEO of Disney, Bob Iger, he's 1,400 times. That's miserable and insane. The CEO of The Gap, his number is about 3,400 times. Now, just to put this in context, okay, in the mid-60s, the CEO to worker ratio was around 20, 30, kind of like in that range, 20 or to 1. Around that range. So look at what has happened. Are these CEOs that much better than all the CEOs we've had for decades before that? The answer is no. They control their boards and they push through these compensation packages and nobody's stopping them.
Right. And I think economists say that the 20% or whatever is standard, normal, right, or expected, if you will, because of the responsibilities and all that. But when you get up to 200, 500, 1,000, 3,000...
200, 500. And the thing is, I don't know if these people have been reading their own press releases or not, but they surely do think they deserve it. I actually don't understand how a human being can look in the mirror and believe that they are worth 3,000 times more than another human being. There's not a person on the planet who is that smart or that remarkable. And if there is one or two, you know what, let's just hold them up as a national treasure and we can all pay them, but they should not be in charge of all of our corporate boardrooms. This is absurd.
Bill Press talking with Erica Payne, Executive Director of Patriotic Millionaires. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, Jane McAlevey and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.